we did an analogy with a Homer Simpson, so an episode of The Simpsons in season 9. Homer.
I'm a Christian. I don't know what that is.
You're a Ned Flanders, but yeah, you don't know what that means. Homer has to climb the Murderhorn, which is the largest mountain in Springfield. It turns out it's actually higher than Everest. Long story short, there are some Sherpas who are with him, and while he's asleep, they drag him up the Murderhorn to the point where he's basically at the top. He wakes up and he utters the immortal line, "Wow, look how far I climbed, and I'm not even tired." And Homer is he's climbed to the top, and he now has this outlook, and he's unaware that he's being carried there by others. And I think that's a modern person with ethics. Where we feel so much superior to our ancestors, and we look down upon them. But we have no idea that we've been carried by Christianity. We've been carried by a very distinct intellectual tradition that's reflecting on the image of God and the person of Christ, and the soteriological truth that we're all one in Christ that has flowed out into society as a sociological truth that we're all equals under the law.
Love God, love people, love people, love people. It's the AC Podcast. For the love of God, love people.
Welcome to the AC Podcast. I, Wes Huff, am sitting down with Glen Scrivener, who is speaking at our 2024 Ontario Apologetics Canada Conference. So we have a live audience. And Glen, who is one of our main session speakers, is here with me.
Woo! Apparently that's what you do.
Glen, why don't you give a little bit of a background? Humanize yourself for us.
I am human. Honestly, I am. I am Emma's husband. I'm Ruby and JJ's dad. I'm from Australia. I live in England. Yeah, on the south coast of England, just south of London. And a lot of my time I spend speaking on university campuses. Some of my time I spend in the studio making YouTube videos and podcasts and that kind of thing. And some of my time I spend training others in evangelism because I work for an organization called Speak Life.
So what we want to talk about here, Glen, is your book, The Air We Breathe, How We All Came to Believe in Freedom, Equality, Kindness, Progress, and Equality. In it describes the extraordinary impact of Christianity that's seen in the fact that we don't notice it. Mm-hmm. Describe for us what you mean when you say that we don't notice the impact.
Well, it's called The Air We Breathe because I grew up in Australia and I never recognized how sweetly Australian air smelt when I lived in Australia. But when I go back to it from the UK, I'll fly into Sydney and you recognize that the eucalyptus trees are just mentholating the air. It's like a cough syrup carried upon the breeze. But you don't notice it if you're in Australia. And you've got to kind of come out of your atmosphere in order to notice what is native to your atmosphere. And I think the same is true about moral intuitions and assumptions, our gut instincts about what is true and good and beautiful. They just seem so obvious to us. They seem natural to us. We assume that our belief in human rights and equality and dignity it's just the air we breathe, and we utterly take it for granted. And so what I want to do in the book is take people out of their own atmosphere and then put them back into it. And one of the ways you could do that is to go to some non-Christian cultures today, but what I mainly try to do is go back to the classical world, especially the Greco-Roman world, out of which early Christianity emerged. And it smells very differently back there, and the moral intuitions and assumptions are incredibly different. And as we notice that, we then ask the question, what changed? And my answer to that question is, well, Christianity, that's what happened.
Yeah, we get snippets of that in something like when you read the New Testament.
Mm-hmm.
But what would be the stark difference between the Greco-Roman world and Christianity that broke into it?
Well, the God of the cross. So for those listening in on the podcast, Wes, you did a talk about the Alexamenos graffiti, and that was, they reckon maybe a 2nd century?
Early 2nd century.
Early 2nd century, scratched into the Palatine Hill in Rome, is probably the earliest depiction of crucifixion. It's not just the earliest depiction of Christ's crucifixion. The Romans weren't particularly interested in depicting crucifixion because the name of the cross was not even meant to be on a Roman's lips. It was a curse word. It was so shameful. And yet, here is this graffiti that satirizes the early Christians. And Alexamenos is this worshiper with his hand raised in veneration towards this image of a figure on a cross with the head of a donkey, because only an asinine god would actually show up on a cross. And just the subtitle, the caption, really shows you the spite that a natural Roman would feel for the followers of God on a cross. Alexamenos worships his god. What a donkey of a god it would be that would show up on a cross, because I think in the ancient world, just legally, there are certain people who you could crucify and certain people who you must not crucify, because that would be utterly shameful. And largely it was slaves and rebels that could be crucified. And you've got a very stratified culture in which, Caesar was at the top and the slaves were at the bottom. And the whole of what justice meant was to know your place in that hierarchy of being. Know your limits, don't get ahead of your station, live wisely on your rung of the ladder. But the ladder was vertiginously steep, going from the slaves all the way up to Caesar and then the gods. And so Christianity coming into that culture in which the one at the top, the God of heaven, actually ends up on a cross at the bottom. That's why it was a scandal. That's why it was utterly what Nietzsche called it was the transvaluation of all ancient values, the flip turned upside down kind of valuation of all ancient values. So I think the cross is right at the heart of, when you imagine standing in a Roman sandals and looking up at the cross, and when you imagine Alexamenos looking up at the cross, you are looking at the same thing, but you're breathing entirely different atmospheres. You're in totally different moral universes as you're doing that. And the New Testament is basically struggling with that reality.
Yeah, it's a context that I think we often miss because we're so used to seeing the cross depicted. I mentioned in my talk, the Alexamenos graffiti is arguably the earliest depiction of Jesus. And actually Christians don't depict Jesus on the cross until the 5th century. Yeah. In fact, there are a number of 2nd century depictions of Jesus, but there's a hesitation to portray Jesus as being crucified until the 5th century and until we get it in illuminated manuscripts in Syriac. But up until that point, you still can, at least some sense, feel the reservation within the Christian community of, we don't shy away from proclaiming this, but it's still so vulgar.
And the earlier depictions of Jesus were much more Jesus the bodybuilder on the cross, like Christus Victor.
Right.
And it takes a long time, even within Christian art, for Christ to be shown as the victim that he really is, because it's a scandalous thought, isn't it?
Yeah, completely different context that we don't often realize that is being situated in that particular time frame. So you talk about the air we breathe, and then you highlight these areas: freedom, kindness, progress, and equality. Freedom. Now we take for granted, that we have freedom of assembly, freedom of movement, freedom of religion. These are things that we talk about within a modern, particularly Western, but modern society. What is the chain of custody that ties that specifically to Judeo-Christianity?
One of the things you have to do is figure out that actually our modern depictions of freedom are sort of post-Christian as well as Christianized, so that when we think of freedom, we tend to think of independence and autonomy and choice, and the younger brother in the parable of the two sons in Luke chapter 15, leaving the father's house and the wind in his hair and I'm free, baby. Is that the kind of freedom that the Bible is talking about? No. It's talking about something better than that. It's Christian freedom is better than post-Christian freedom, but it's also better than pre-Christian freedom. And pre-Christian freedom was very much that fate determines everything, right? And the great, Greek dramas are all about people trying to escape their fate. And no matter what they do, they end up falling into the pit that was prophesied for them by some Cassandra figure. And fate is something you can never, ever escape from. And again, it's this very hierarchical understanding of the world in which know your place and just live wisely within your limits. And one of the things that starts to happen is in the Bible, it starts telling this story of, well, the Hebrews, they once were slaves in Egypt, and then there's a wonderful redemption that happens, and as they are brought out of Egypt, also Egypt is taken out of them through the wilderness period, and they're headed on this trajectory towards the promised land. And at that point, you get a real belief in redemption. You get a real questioning of the powers that are above us, that perhaps they are not virtuous. Perhaps a pharaoh might not have the right to rule over you, which is a really revolutionary thought for a classical person to kind of think on. And then you get Christ coming out to do the new Exodus and to be the one who dies the slave's death and then rises up again in order to break the chains of the ultimate pharaoh, Satan, and sin and death, and handing to Christians a place in his family. But it's not exactly the modern sense of freedom. The modern sense of freedom is, okay, the chains are broken so that you can go and fulfill yourself and be the individual that you were created to be. Whereas right back in Exodus, it's, let my people go that they may serve me, says the Lord. Serve me. Okay, so you no longer serve Pharaoh, but now you serve the Lord. And that's your true liberation. In the same way that the prodigal son comes back from the far country, but then he finds freedom in the arms of the Father, which is a very different kind of a freedom. He's never been more liberated than when he is actually constrained within the love of his Father. But this is the kind of freedom that Christians start to live out. And the kind of freedom that they start to live out is where sex and death are the necessities of life. You can think about that in a classical sense. You can also think about in a Darwinian sense, right? Sex and death is kind of reproduction and survival, the two imperatives that your biology has handed you. They're also just the two imperatives that every civilization has had to kind of deal with down through the ages. But what Christians start to do with the liberation that they have in Jesus, now that they're a son of the Father filled with the Spirit, their brother Jesus is their Lord, and there are no other lords for them to answer to. That's an amazing liberation in which you start to get two things. You get martyrs and virgins, right? You start to get these martyrs who are like, I'm not going to burn incense to Caesar. He's not Lord. Only Jesus is Lord. And of course, they are threatened at that point, at the point of the sword. And will you get thrown to the lions and confess, or will you confess Caesar as Lord? And they will, no, we will embrace death. And they are the freest people on the planet as they go to their deaths. And martyrdoms start to be this incredible protest against the necessity of death. Here are a people who don't have to march to the drumbeat of survival and do anything to survive. They've actually been liberated by Jesus so much that they can be a martyr. And they've actually been liberated by Jesus so much that they can be a virgin. They can forswear having progeny, having offspring, which was your only sort of shot at immortality in so many ways in a Roman understanding. They're like, no, we don't need to do that. We can forswear sex. We can forswear survival because we've been made free in Jesus. And this is the kind of freedom that started to grip the ancient world, and they'd never seen anything like it. And it's very interesting that the phrase free will was first used in Christian communities in the early centuries as those from the outside were looking in on virgins. And they were like, why are so many Christians forswearing sex and marriage? They seem to be exercising this thing called free will, right? And at that point, you see how different Christian freedom is from the post-Christian idea of freedom, right? Nowadays, freedom is, I'm free to have sex with whoever I want to have. I think there's a really much deeper, much more ancient, radical freedom that the gospel has always offered people. You're free not to. Oh my goodness. Like, there's a freedom in asceticism and a freedom in denying that drumbeat of survival and sex. So Christians have always embraced this strange thing called freedom. And I think we ought to continue to try to resist that, even as post-Christianity tries to enslave us, just enslave us with a different kind of language.
It is interesting what critics of Christianity, particularly in the earliest few centuries, reveal about the Christian culture, things like free will, or the accusation of them being atheists because they deny the gods, or antisocial because they won't participate in the pagan activities of the day. And they're these strange oddballs who are going around saying, your gods don't exist, in a world where all the gods obviously existed. I mean, the ancient world we often describe as polytheistic, and that's true, but it was more so henotheistic, in that there was categories and there's hierarchies of gods. And so for one group to say another group's gods don't exist at all, that was strange. The Jews got away with it because it was tied to their ethnicity and culture.
Yes.
But anybody could be a Christian.
Yeah.
And so for you, you have the famous line of Tertullian who says, when the Tiber River is too high, that's the river in Rome, or the Nile River is too low, that's the river in Egypt, the cry will ring out the Christians to the lions.
Yeah.
Why? Because, well, the gods are obviously angry because there are a bunch of people going around saying they don't exist.
Yeah.
And so it's often these critiques that we get from Christianity, which reveal these things which today we think atheists.
The
Christians aren't atheists.
Yeah.
Those are the non-Christians.
Yeah. And linked to that is this idea that, okay, the Jews are allowed to have their protest against the gods.
Right.
That's been their peculiarity the whole time. But then how do we understand these Christians who say that they're part of the Judaism thing, but they don't become Hebrews? And this is another thing that's absolutely rocking the ancient world. Surely you either just take on the gods of Galatia if you're in Galatia, right? Or if you want to convert to the God of the Hebrews, well, just become a Hebrew, why don't you?
Yeah.
And these Christians are doing this weird thing where apparently I can be a good Galatian and not a Hebrew, and yet I worship the God of the Hebrews, and I'm a good Galatian without worshiping the gods of Galatia. And suddenly you get this separation of church and state sort of thing in seed form. Suddenly you get this difference between what a religion is, right? And the fact that you can actually give to Caesar what is Caesar's and give to God what is God's. And actually your nationality doesn't define you and your culture doesn't define you. There's a God who is above all those things, all of which is just the air we breathe now.
Right.
But you can see why the New Testament is constantly wrestling with this. We have to call counsel this and counsel that. So what do we do about keeping kosher? And am I allowed to eat this kebab or not? And we're like, what do we do about circumcision? Like so much of the New Testament is written about this because it's just a radical idea. That you can be a member of a certain society without worshiping that society's gods because there's a God who is above it. It's a radical thing.
Yeah, it's a good point. Conversion wasn't that unusual in the ancient world.
Right. Yeah.
The beef with the Christians was not that people were converting. It was that they were converting and then they were importing all of this other stuff that is foreign to just regular Greco-Roman society.
Yeah.
That is antithetical to just a normal, good citizen and how that would be categorized.
Yeah.
You said one thing that I want to capitalize on, in that you talked about sex. Because the ancient world and the modern world seems to have a preoccupation with sex.
Sure.
And in some ways very similar, and in some ways very different. And I think the difference is, and this is what you talk about in your book, The Air We Breathe, is the idea of consent. Is the idea of consent being a Christian value that we often don't think of today. If there is a high ethic that you must not break, it's consent.
Yep.
How does that find its origin? How does the fruit of that go to the roots of Christianity?
I mean, pederasty, the Greek word means child love, was absolutely kind of rife within the Greek world. The Romans, who are more militaristic, saw that as a little bit more effeminate, but they didn't have sort of moral arguments against pederasty. It was an aesthetic judgment, really. But initiating children into the ways of sex and sexuality with older men, usually with younger boys, was taken for granted, really, and given the name child love, pederasty, child love. But Jews and Christians uniformly called it child destruction, not child love. And as soon as Christians had the reins of power, they outlawed it in the 4th century, to the point where slaves could make charges against their masters even decades after the fact, if they have abused them in any way sexually, which is just an absolute revolution.
They put out a Twitter thread, right? That's how it works?
Yeah. They would go to court, and in the same way that, like Harvey Weinstein, what do you call him in the Greco-Roman world? Like business as usual. And let's be honest, it was business as usual in Hollywood until whistleblowers kind of stopped that nonsense. But the idea that you could get away with it legally in the ancient world is kind of a shocking thing for people to hear. But there was a sexual revolution, and when you think of the sexual revolution, you probably think of the 1960s, but I think a lot of historians are recognizing that 1900 years before the swinging 60s, there was the revolution that really has shaped our sensibilities about sex and sexuality. Matthew 19, Jesus comes and he says, one man, one woman, for life, that's your lot. And, and if you don't want that, well, there's this other very venerable station in life. It's called being a eunuch for the kingdom. You could be a virgin, right? Like, here's this other station in life, but it's one or the other. And if you've chosen marriage, then the doors are locked. No one gets out of this thing alive, right? And the red-blooded men, right, who are listening to Jesus, they say, if this is the case, it would be better if we weren't married. And Matthew doesn't tell us what their wives said when Matthew publishes his gospel. Did you say that? So it'd be better not to be married? But this is the marriage and family program that has built the modern world. And this is what lots of people have noticed. So Joseph Henrich is an evolutionary biologist from Harvard. He wrote a book called The Weirdest People in the World, okay? If you're a Westerner, you are weird, okay? And he means by that the acronym Western, Educated, Industrialized, Rich, and Democratic. That's very peculiar. This is not the way that most people see the world, even today, let alone down through history. What has caused our mindset to be so weird, Joseph Henrich is utterly clear. It's the marriage and family program of the early church. It's Matthew chapter 19. It's one man, one woman for life, because suddenly you've got the equalization of the sexes. And what the AD, kind of the first century revolution is saying is men had always been allowed to sow their wild oats, and women were always expected to be virgins on their wedding nights and chaste throughout marriage, right? Faithful throughout marriage, right? And yet what Jesus is saying is, no, men have to be virgins as well, right? And one of the reasons why he uses the euphemism eunuchs for the kingdom is, like, literally in ancient languages, the word for virgin, like, is a female word. Like, there's not a way of describing a virgin. An adult male virgin doesn't make sense in a lot of ancient languages.
Classical Latin, it's awkward. Yeah. To say male virgin. It doesn't make sense. It's like putting the wrong case on the wrong verb.
Yeah. You just expect, of course you expect women to be virgins on their wedding nights, but not men. And what Jesus is saying, no, let's eradicate the double standard, men and women together in this thing called marriage for life, lifelong matrimony. And then you come to 1 Corinthians chapter 7, and Paul brings into the marriage bed utter mutuality. The wife's body belongs to the husband, and every ancient thinker would nod along and say, absolutely, amen, right? And then he says, and the husband's body belongs to the wife. Are you kidding me? Like, bringing in that mutuality, that equality, and only by consent, right, is what he says in 1 Corinthians 7. And what's fascinating is that it took 1900 years for most Western countries to catch up with that chapter of the Bible, because marital rape in the UK, for instance, and in the US was not outlawed until the 1970s. And yet consent is put right at the heart of the married relationship in the Bible 1900 years earlier. So consent is at the heart of the sexual revolution, as are things like man and woman for life. What has happened such that only consent remains. The modern sexual understanding is that consent is the only value that we prize when it comes to the sexual revolution, the sexual relationship. Why is that? Well, the 1960s sexual revolution has come along. And instead of the equalization of the sex being men must be as restricted as women have been expected to be, what does the 1960s say? Well, through the pill, right, through contraception, through widespread abortion as well, women can be as liberated, let's say, as men have always been expected to be. And people sort of say, oh, that's the first time that equality came in. No, that's not the first time equality came in. Equality happened in the Christian sexual revolution. This is a different kind of equality in which libido kind of runs amok in the world. And we've seen so much of the downside of that in the last 60 years. But the one thing that we still hold on to is a thing that the Christian Revolution has taught us, which is that consent is at the heart of the sexual relationship.
25 different ways to say prostitute in Latin, but
Yeah.
you can't find a natural way to say male,
Male
virgin.
No.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. So related to that, the freedom conversation, because freedom, and in its kind of the piggybacking of equality, we assume that obviously it's good to be free, but obviously we live in a society where we're equal and everybody's equal. And we just assume that we're equal by virtue of being human beings. But that isn't always the way it was it?
No. Natural inequality was woven into the natural order. So Larry Seidentop wrote a great book in 2013 called Inventing the Individual. And he points out that a common way of looking back on the Dark Ages and everything that happened before the Enlightenment is basically there was classical antiquity, which was this sort of paradise, and they were naive back then, and wouldn't it be nice to be a Roman? And then there was this horrible fall into the Dark Ages, where Christendom took hold, and it was just full of battles and boils and bubonic plague, right? But then, thank our lucky stars, Immanuel Kant said, "Let there be enlightenment," and there was enlightenment, right? What do you notice about that shape of the story, right? The shape of the story is biblical, isn't it? The shape of the story is a profoundly Christian kind of a story. There's a paradise, there's a fall, and there's a bringing into the light, okay? Because the Enlightenment was still thinking very Christian thoughts, even as it opposed Christianity. And so what Larry Seidentop does is say, no, when you go back to classical antiquity, it wasn't this naive paradise, okay? Inequality was woven into life. The units, the natural units of social organization was not the individual. That's a very Christianized idea. It was the family, with the paterfamilias, the father of the household, as the high priest, and he would keep the fires burning that connected you to your ancestors, and he himself would become a god, when he died and ascended to be with the gods, and his firstborn son was being initiated to being the priest who would burn the incense to the ancestors and keep the fires burning. And that paterfamilias had life or death power over the rest of his household and the slaves and everything. And so it was this very steep hierarchy of being. And the family was the units of society. And even when you think in purely Darwinian terms, like kin selection, like what does natural selection kind of operate on? It kind of operates not on the individual, but if I'm trying to preserve my genes, then it actually helps if I preserve not only my family, but my cousins and my second cousins. And again, nature doesn't teach you that individuals are these inviolable centers of autonomy with sovereign wills that must be respected. Like, nature doesn't teach you that. Larry Seidentop says, you know what has taught us that? It's the image of God on the first page of the Bible. It's the fact that we all have souls and are accountable to God. It's the fact that Christ has been the image of God. He died and rose again to invite us into a family where there are no lords except Christ himself, and we're all brothers and sisters at table with the Lord. And as canon lawyers through medieval history started to meditate on this, and disputes were brought to the churches in the ecclesiastical courts, they started to come up with concepts like rights, natural rights, human rights. And they were the flip side of the obligations that we have. So if I have the obligation to give to the poor, then the canon rights lawyers reasoned, well, the poor person actually has a right to provision and protection, don't they? And they started this language of natural rights that everybody possesses, rich or poor, slave or free, black or white, male or female. And it has a totally Christian kind of origin. And it is utterly different to the Enlightenment telling of history. The Enlightenment telling of history is, wasn't it great back in the good old days? Christianity ruined everything, but don't worry, we're correcting that now. And Larry Seidentop says, no, it's if you want to trace back where the individual is and where the wonder of human dignity and human worth comes from, it's a biblical story all the way back.
Seeing the stark contrast, years ago when I was doing studies in the ancient Near East, and I read the Code of Hammurabi.
Yeah.
A lot of people refer to the Code of Hammurabi,
Yeah.
but very few people actually read the Code of Hammurabi. And what stood out to me was that ideas like freedom and equality are stratified.
Yes.
The king has a lot more freedoms than the people within the middle of the section, and the people down here, they've really got barely any rights.
Yes.
And they are not equal. They are largely lesser thans. You know, if you steal from a fellow person within the upper echelon of society, there is a particular more of what we would consider an equal punishment. But if you steal from a poor person, well, that's too bad for them.
No harm, no foul.
They shouldn't have been able to be stolen from to begin with.
Yeah, you're right. Yeah.
And that just being this stark contrast of no, this is something we assume today.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's like a video that's just come out on our channel, Speak Life, like, share, and subscribe. We did an analogy with a Homer Simpson. So an episode of The Simpsons in season 9. Homer.
I'm a Christian. I don't know what that is.
You're a Ned Flanders, but yeah, you don't know what that means. Homer has to climb the Murderhorn, which is the largest mountain in Springfield. It turns out it's actually higher than Everest. Long story short, there are some Sherpas who are with him, and while he's asleep, they drag him up the Murderhorn to the point where he's basically at the top. He wakes up and he utters the immortal line, "Wow, look how far I climbed, and I'm not even tired." And Homer is he's climbed to the top, and he now has this outlook, and he's unaware that he's being carried there by others. And I think that's a modern person with ethics. Where we feel so much superior to our ancestors, and we look down upon them, but we have no idea that we've been carried by Christianity. We've been carried by a very distinct intellectual tradition that's reflecting on the image of God and the person of Christ, and the soteriological truth that we're all one in Christ that has flowed out into society as a sociological truth that we're all equals under the law. We're totally unaware of that, and this is why I say the success of Christianity is seen in the fact that we don't notice it. Because now we stand on the top of Mount Rights, and we just think it's natural, obvious, and universal that we're all these inviolable centers of worth and dignity, and I'm equal to you. It's self-evident, as the Declaration of Independence in 1776 says. But it's only self-evident to a culture that has been so Christianized, you don't even recognize the air that you're breathing. And that's why I always want to sort of come out of our Christian bubble, either back to the ancient world, or there's plenty of worldviews today that have a caste system.
Yeah.
And it's not obvious to all people. And it's not obvious scientifically that we're all equal. Take any two people and judge them by any one metric, and of course there'll be some who are richer, some who are poorer, some who are stronger, some who are weaker, some who are more economically viable, some who are not. What you discover when you study people is different. Where do you get this equality thing from? It's found with some very Christian presuppositions, actually.
It's obvious at face value, but whose face is looking at it?
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I remember when Richard Dawkins wrote, he had The God Delusion, and then he had River Out of Eden.
Yeah.
And there was another fellow atheist teaching at the London School of Economics, a guy named John Gray.
Right.
Now, there are two John Grays. One wrote Men Are From Mars, Women Are From Venus. That's not this John Gray. This John Gray, a self-described atheist, wrote a series of essays called The Straw Dogs, where he critiqued Dawkins by saying, listen, you're a good biologist. You believe that we're a product of time plus matter plus chance, but then you want to ascribe value and purpose and intention and rights to human beings.
Yeah.
And you can't do that.
No.
You're borrowing from the Christian Judeo concept of being created in the image of God. That's where it comes from.
100%.
And I think appropriately identified that inconsistency. I mean, last night you mentioned, Glenn, both the Atrahasis and the Epic of Gilgamesh. And ironically, when you read how the ancients believed we got our value and purpose, which was basically you don't have any value and purpose because you're the end product of a mistake of the gods.
Yep.
And you look at Dawkins and he says, well, you're the end result of time plus matter plus chance. You're just a bunch of meat bags running into other meat bags, right?
Yeah, it's a pagan view.
Yeah, it's a pagan. They're not all that different.
No.
And he has to import the idea of intrinsic human value from what we believe because of the fact that we believe that every person, despite their ability to contribute to society, has value by being a human.
Yeah, and you see that with like Yuval Noah Harari. So he's written a number of bestsellers, but the two largest ones have been Sapiens and then Homo Deus. And Sapiens, he tells this brutal evolutionary history of where humans have come from, according to Harari. And he's on record as saying it is absolutely the Bible that has taught us to have human rights. Because if you just take a human being and you cut them open, you look inside, you don't discover any rights, you know? It's like, yeah, step away from the scalpel, Harari. Like, this is why we have rights, so that these experiments are ruled out of court by the ethical board.
At the end of the day, on the inside, we're all red and gooey.
We're all red and gooey. And at that stage, he's utterly right. It is the story that we've been told. That's the way he would phrase it. It's the story that we've been told from the Bible that gives us these values. They are not derivable from science. And in a sense, I prefer the honesty of Harari to, at times, the naivety of Dawkins, who thinks that we can derive, vaguely humanistic ethics from science. But I often think science it's a bit like, Narcissus at the edge of the lake, looking down into the lake. If Narcissus wanted to describe the subaquatic environment of the lake, he would be doing good science. But if he wanted it to tell him anything about himself, all he would see is his own reflection. And I think you get a lot of people looking into science and they say, oh yeah, my ethics, they're just derived from science. And what they only ever do is read their own prejudices out of science. They just see their own reflection. And so for 100 years after the publication of The Origin of the Species, scientific racism was totally a respectable thing. There were human zoos, like millions of people would go and visit where tribespeople had been taken from Papua New Guinea or Africa and put in enclosures to wrestle with their orangutans, and massive signs put up saying, we've discovered the missing link, and anthropologists loved it. You know who was protesting against the human zoos the entire time? Those regressive Christians who couldn't understand that this is where progress was leading us. Don't you want to get on board with the science train, right? And it's just a real lesson to us, like, do not take at face value every claim to progress, right? People will come to you and say that the sexual revolution of the 1960s is entirely a work of progress. I think there were some gains. I think, for instance, I've already mentioned that marital rape was enshrined in law because of some of the developments since the 1960s, and for that I give great thanks. Okay, that is progress in that sphere. But not every claim to progress is true. And I think a lot of what is forwarded to us as progressive is repaganizing. Scientific racism is repaganizing. A lot of the fruits of the sexual revolution of the 1960s has involved repaganizing, not only in the sexual realm, but as regards to abortion. I mean, like, infanticide was just rife in the pagan world, right? And what do you call that? Do you call that progress? Or I think with our historical hats on, we can look at this kind of stuff, and at least as Christians, we have a standard above history to say some things are progressive steps, like marital rape on the statute books. Okay, that's a progressive step. But a lot of steps are regressive steps, because we've actually got a pole star above us by which we can navigate.
Yeah, you can progress off the end of a cliff.
Right.
Yeah.
And at that point, the movement that leads to most human flourishing might be to repent and turn around.
Right.
At that point.
Yeah. Darwin's The Origin of Species, the subtitle is no longer printed on the editions. If you go into, if you try to buy the Darwin's The Origin of Species on Amazon, what they have left out is that the subtitle was, "Or the Preservation of Favored Races in the Struggle for Life."
Yeah.
And that was an assumption.
Yeah.
That was not unusual. They looked at certain peoples and they said, well, obviously they're inferior. They're lesser than, because they're not as civilized. They're not as progressive as, say, we are in the Western world.
And that's important about a lot of the debates that happened in the aftermath of Darwin. They are easily characterized as Christians being anti-science. A lot of them were motivated by Christians protesting outside the human zoos, saying, this is not progress at all. It was the moral dimensions of Darwinism and Darwinism becoming social Darwinism that actually motivated a lot of the protests against Darwin. And I think a lot of those protests get mischaracterized these days.
Yeah, yeah. So we only have a few minutes left, but I want you to break down what seems like the easiest one and most direct line to Christianity, but kindness. How is kindness, especially in light of the fact that you have Eastern philosophies like Buddhism, Taoism, Shintoism, that have a concept of kindness, or at least preservation of the natural world, not doing harm. How do we, in our understanding of kindness, derive that from the Bible?
You've got to define kindness in a Christian sense. Not only because you're in conversation with other faiths, but also because there's a very post-Christian form of kindness. You know, the Be Kind hashtag is often affixed to some of the most cruel behavior online. Have you ever noticed that? In the name of kindness, people are going to flame each other online. So you need to define terms, right? Stop being unkind is a lot of discourse, especially on our YouTube channel comment section. Anyway. But
we'll share some of our hate at apologeticscanada.com with you guys.
We'll vent at each other. So what does kindness, I think the story of the Good Samaritan is classic compassion, isn't it? The Good Samaritan, filled with compassion, went to where the man was and poured out the oil and wine on his wounds and intervened in this situation and did not allow nature to take its course. And through that intervention actually raised him up and brought him healing that was supernatural. The natural end of that guy beaten up by the side of the road was death. The supernatural thing was this compassion that enters in. And the Good Samaritan had to get his hands dirty and roll up his sleeves and intervene. That's quite different to a Buddhist sense of compassion, in which, I mean, I have a Buddhist friend who I think rightly raises a note of warning with me when I start talking about Christian compassion. They say, beware of diving in with both feet to situations in which, you know, if somebody's drowning, you need to make sure that you're grounded and you've got one hand on the tree before. And codependency is a real problem, isn't it? And sometimes don't we get involved in problems that aren't really our problems, but we do it for our sake and not for their sake? And I think my Buddhist friend makes some decent points at that point. But also my Buddhist friend is noticing that the Christian idea of compassion is to dive in with both feet into this situation and to get your hands very, very dirty. And what does Jesus do? Like, he does not benignly smile at a suffering world and keep himself separate in tranquility. What he does is go through godforsaken agony on the cross to drag us out of our suffering and up into a peace. He does say peace, doesn't he? But he says peace on Sunday, right? On Friday, he says, my God, why have you forsaken me? And the way to a Christian kind of peace is through suffering for the sake of the other. And the kind of compassion that Christianity pioneers is quite a different kind of compassion to the Buddhist sense. And therefore, again, as I said yesterday, I'm not at all saying that a Buddhist or anyone else can't out-compassion a Christian. There are lots of people who don't share my faith who can be better human beings than I can be. But I don't think any of them can have a better story that grounds their compassion, in which the highest figure descended down to the deepest depth in order to raise us up to his heights forever. Like the dimensions of our story of compassion are unimprovable in that sense. And therefore, no wonder things like charity, things like the abolition of pederasty, things like the abolition of the gladiatorial games, things like the abolition of the slave trade, no wonder those happened within this framework. This happened pioneered by people who believe this story, because I think this story is a radically different one from the Buddhist or any other story.
Yeah, I don't think it's a coincidence that the most repeated verse of the Bible in the Bible is a version of Exodus 34:6, when God reveals himself and he says, I'm merciful, I'm compassionate, I am abounding in steadfast love and kindness. Yeah. And although there's different iterations of that throughout the Psalms, throughout the prophets, it's Jonah's beef with God. He goes to Nineveh and he says, I didn't want to come here because I knew that if they repented, you are such a loving, such a compassionate, such a kind God that you would forgive them.
Yeah.
And the common denominator is that word compassion.
Yeah. I mean, within the Muslim prayers, I mean, a lot of the surahs begin with, Allah, the most merciful, the most compassionate.
Yeah.
And so, the 5 prayers of the day, begin with Allah, the most merciful, the most compassionate. I think that the difference is what has Allah done to demonstrate that compassion?
Yeah.
It's sort of, again, it's the same question that I want to ask of some people who use the Be Kind hashtag. What are you doing to demonstrate actual kindness on the ground? But I was in a debate with an imam a few years ago on Justin Brierley's program, and I asked the imam, what has Allah done to demonstrate compassion? And I said, in our story, God has descended to the deepest, darkest pit of hell in order to raise up the world to share in his glory forevermore, okay? That's what our God has done. What has Allah done to demonstrate compassion? And he said, well, there is a story in the Quran of a woman who was wronged by her husband, and the divorce laws weren't serving her, and so Allah allowed Muhammad to relax the divorce laws so that she could get a better settlement. Do you guys have the Pepsi challenge over here? Right? Like, taste the difference. It's very easy to talk about compassion, but what have you done to actually demonstrate it?
Yeah. And then you have, not to commit an etymological fallacy, but calm meaning with in Latin, and passion meaning suffering.
Yeah.
What does the God who is continually described as compassionate do? He steps out of eternity and into humanity in the second person of the Trinity, in Jesus, and then he experiences suffering in a way that no other divine figure does, no other hero does in the epics, and ultimately takes on the punishment that we deserve.
There are echoes of it within Buddhism. There is, the suffering of the Buddha, that he might have come through it and bestow his teaching on others. And there are some schools of Buddhism in which the peace that you have at the eye of the storm happens when you step out into the cyclone, and on the far side of that, there's a kind of a peace. And what I say to my Buddhist friends at that point is, keep pulling at that thread, because I don't think that's the ultimate story of ultimate suffering leading to ultimate peace. Maybe there is an echo of the gospel in that telling of the story, and I'm not threatened by that at all. Maybe the song has carried and been echoed in other religious traditions, and I think that's true. I believe in common grace. But what I would say to the Buddhist at that point is, cool story, but can I like take you to the original, the highest of heights, descending to the deepest of depths through the most amount of suffering to bring global peace forever. I think you'll find true fulfillment in Jesus.
Yeah, I had a friend who was a former Muslim, and he said that the phrase Allahu Akbar, God is the greatest, was said very commonly in his household, and it wasn't until he realized when he read the Bible that if God was the greatest, he would exemplify the greatest ethic, which is love, in the greatest possible way, which is self-sacrifice. And that's not what he saw in the Quran, and that's exactly what he saw in the Bible.
So Allah Akbar actually took him to Jesus.
Yeah, ironically. Yeah. Well, that is our time. Let's give Glen a round of applause. The air we breathe, how we all came to believe in freedom, kindness, progress, and equality. I think we might be sold out, but make sure you run down to the book table and get the last copy that may or may not be there. Otherwise, Amazon.ca, right?
Sure.
Okay. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.